Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is entitled Financial Risk Part 5, the risk of fiat money. Up until this point in the financial risk portion of this course, we've been dealing mostly with fractals. The reason we've talked about this is because traditional measures of financial volatility, ones based around Gaussian or normal shapes of the bell curve, are in fact usually incorrect in estimating the types of volatility that we see historically in markets. For example, when Mandelbrot looked at cotton prices, he noticed that the volatility was far more extreme and far more frequently extreme than would be predicted under the traditional bell curve. In addition to that, he also noted that when things became extreme, and they do so more frequently, that they tend to persist as extreme. For that reason, we needed to come up with new methodologies to try to model what exactly is going on in markets. That being said, there are some traditional risks that have been posed by financial, fiscal, and monetary authorities that have amplified the risks in the marketplace, in my opinion. For that reason, I've decided in this course to select two issues that we're going to discuss for further detail when we're talking about financial risk. One of those is fiat money, and the second of those will be free trade zones that we'll talk about in the next class. Now, I know for financial risk we could talk about countless numbers of topics. We just don't have the time in this course to cover it all. I'm covering what I think are the salient macroeconomic issues that will be pressing issues at the times this course is being taught. So let's get started with the first of the two issues I want to deal with, where government authorities have intervened in financial markets in ways that I think have augmented and heightened the financial volatility of markets and created potentially more risk than otherwise would have been there, even accepting the fact that markets are traditionally far riskier than was previously thought. So to do this, we need to think a little bit about prices, and we need to think about how prices are estimated relative to other things in the marketplace. One of the ways I like to motivate this is by talking about something called a numeraire good. A numeraire good is usually just dollars in the denominator, but it doesn't have to be dollars. It can be any object or thing that in fact serves as money. A stick of butter could be a numeraire good if we wanted it to, and here I've created four ratios where I've set up basically a price table. 4 chicken sandwiches is 1 stick of butter. 2 ham sandwiches is 1 stick of butter, and 1 hamburger gets you 1 stick of butter. In this case, butter serves as a price index. It's something that is readily tradable and everyone seems to recognize across multiple goods is a tradable object. So if I have chicken sandwiches and I want to get hamburgers, I could, if nobody's willing to trade me directly for a chicken sandwich for a hamburger, I could trade for a stick of butter and then use that stick of butter to get a hamburger. It doesn't really matter whether it's butter or dollars or coins or iron hose. It could be anything. The point being is there's some sort of numeraire good serving as the barter object, the intermediary device in order to create markets of opportunity. If butter is universally recognized as money like that, we could say that at any given time that the market seems to be preferring hamburgers to hams to chickens. And the reason for that is it takes relatively more butter to buy a hamburger than to buy chicken sandwiches. And for that reason, we could say hamburgers are more expensive than chicken sandwiches. Okay, this gives us a very little bit of a basic background on relative price ratios. Now, what I want to talk about briefly is counterfeiting, because counterfeiting and fiat money go hand in hand with each other. Counterfeiting is basically where I can change the relative price and tip it in my favor if I'm a counterfeiter. If it's $1 buys me 1 cup of coffee. I know Starbucks certainly does not give us that sort of benefit. But if $1 bought me 1 cup of coffee, and I chose instead to create monopoly money that I could easily pass off in the marketplace as real money, then what's happened here is I have effectively created an additional money supply. It's indistinguishable from real money. And so as a counterfeiter, I've taken advantage of the fact that there's a limited amount of real money out there, created additional money for myself, and used that to buy products I otherwise would not be able to earn and spend my money on because I didn't have that money in the first place. For that reason, counterfeiting actually damages the marketplace, because what it does is when there's $2 chasing one cup of coffee instead of $1 chasing one cup of coffee, the price of the coffee will go up for everyone, not just for me, the counterfeiter, but because there's more money in circulation chasing the same number of goods as before, the price of the goods relative to money goes up. And so the price of coffee might go to $1.20 or $1.50 or even $2 instead of being the original $1. In other words, counterfeiting actually can form inflation in the marketplace and create an unfair effect on those people who are using legitimate, honest money to pay. Keep this in mind, because when we're talking about fiat money, which is government printed money, the same concept of counterfeiting actually applies. Only this time it's the government legally printing counterfeit money rather than counterfeiters printing illegal money. The effect, though, is the same, one of inflation in the market for everyone else whose money supply is fixed. We'll talk about this more in just a moment. Let's use a couple of motivating examples to see how we can get through and understand this issue of inflation a bit better. Imagine we have a hypothetical economy in which there's 1,000 people living in this place, and there's $1,000 in circulation, divided up equally. Everyone, in other words, has $1. And let's assume everybody spends their money on coffee, and a cup of coffee costs $1. So if I were to ask you the question, how many cups of coffee can each of the 1,000 people afford? The answer would be, of course, 1. Everybody spends all their money on coffee. Everyone has $1. A cup of coffee costs $1, and I can get 1 cup of coffee for that. Okay, now that that example's done, and that's the baseline scenario, let's do some hypotheticals that change this around a little bit. Imagine the Archangel Gabriel, a benevolent angel, comes down and magically gifts everybody an additional $1,000. What a generous angel. So now there's $2,000 in circulation. Remember, we originally had $1,000. Now there's $2,000 in circulation. But let's assume that the Archangel is fair and he gives everybody an equal amount of extra money. In other words, everybody gets $1 additional dollar. So all 1,000 people now have $2 each instead of $1 each. Everybody spends all their money on coffee. And a cup of coffee used to cost $1 when there were $1,000 in circulation. But Starbucks, all of a sudden, overnight, everybody's coming in with $2 of money. And they're saying, my goodness, where did all this money come from? Everybody's spending like crazy on Starbucks. So Starbucks is not stupid. They realize that there's a rush on their coffee all of a sudden. They're going to instantaneously raise their prices to accommodate the fact that there is now more money chasing the same number of cups of coffee as before. Let's say they double their price to $2 a cup, just to keep the math simple. If that's the case, that a cup of coffee used to be $1, but now everyone has $2, what has happened here in terms of how many cups of coffee I can buy after the Archangel has operated? The answer you should come up with is I can still buy 1 cup of coffee in this scenario if I have $2. The same as before. Here's what's interesting about that. The Archangel doubled the amount of money, and yet I can still only buy exactly the same number of cups of coffee as before. And that's because relative to everyone else, my relative wealth did not change. Everyone doubled in their wealth, and so as a result, what I can buy with that additional money has not changed relative to before. What we do want to see, though, is the following scenario, and imagine this third scenario as being a little different than what we've seen so far. There's $1,000 in circulation already, just like in the other two scenarios, and that money is equally distributed. Everyone has $1. The Archangel Gabriel comes down in this scenario and again is going to bestow $1,000 of extra money. But unlike the last time where he gave it across the population equally, he decides this time to give all that additional money to one person, Bobby. So in other words, Bobby is going to have $1,001, his original dollar, plus 1,000 new dollars given only to him by the Archangel. Everyone else still has their original $1. Let's again assume everyone's spending all their money on coffee. A cup of coffee used to cost $1 when there were $1,000 in circulation. But Everyone's rushed out to buy coffee, including Bobby, who's now going to plunk down $1,001 on the table to buy coffee rather than just the $1 he used to have. Remember, we're assuming everyone spends all their money on coffee. So Starbucks doubles its price, just like in the last scenario where there were $2,000 in circulation. It doubles its price here to $2 a cup. Now the question that comes up here is, how many cups of coffee can Bobby afford under this scenario? And how many cups of coffee can the other 999 people in the economy afford? Think about both those questions for just a moment. In the case of Bobby, we should come up with the fact that he can now afford 500 cups of coffee. 2 times 500 is 1,000. He'll have $1 left over, assuming Starbucks doesn't sell half cups for half price. So Bobby can buy 500 cups of coffee in this economy. But what about the other 999 people? If each of them comes in and individually tries to buy a cup of coffee with their $1, how many cups of coffee can they afford? The answer here you should come up with is 0, because the price of coffee has doubled to 2, and yet they only have $1. Here's what's interesting about this scenario relative to the last one we just saw, where everyone got an equal additional amount of money. Here, where the additional money is asymmetrically or unequally distributed to Bobby, the effect is that everyone else is crowded out of the market and can no longer afford the coffee they used to be able to afford. But Bobby can buy an exorbitantly extra amount of coffee than he used to. And so Bobby's additional gift from the archangel has in effect created inflation in the economy. Everyone else did not get the additional money that Bobby got. And so they were in effect taxed because Bobby's spending of that money raised the prices of goods and services in the community. In this case, we kept it simple and said the only good was coffee. And by doing that, Bobby could, of course, buy himself a lot of coffee. But everyone else became that much poorer by not being able to buy any. If you ever want to ask, why is my salary going up a little bit or at least staying the same, and yet it's harder and harder to keep up just to meet the bills that I always did, that's because of inflation. It's a form of hidden tax. And what it basically does is it hits the people hardest who get the money last. People who are on fixed pensions like Medicare or Medicaid or welfare or Social Security, where the amount of increase in their budget each year is pegged to last year's inflation rate and not this year's, are always playing catch up to the people who get money first. And where does that money come from? Well, the answer, it comes from the central banks, and they are printing what in effect is counterfeit money, only they're able to do so legally. The rest of this lecture will deal with that scenario and exactly why it is that central banks are printing such money, why they're allowed to do so, and we might ask also the question, and this will be the topic we talk about next, is it lawful to do the things they're doing in any other sector besides banking? So, we've talked about this for today. The point I wanted to take home is counterfeiting is illegal because it in effect creates inflation in the economy. The counterfeiter has additional money, and when they have additional money that looks real, they are in fact increasing the money supply in society for themselves. It's as if the archangel came down and sprinkled additional money in their pocket. They can rush out and spend that money before prices have gone up and benefit from it personally. But by spending that money, they cause prices to rise for everyone else in society. And so everyone else suffers inflation because of counterfeiters. And what I'm suggesting, and we will see in the next lecture, is that when the government prints more money, it acts like the Archangel Gabriel in the second scenario, where it's not all given to everyone equally at the same time, but is given preferentially to friends of the banks before fixed income people get it last. And they therefore suffer because it's an unequal distribution of money in society. So I've said a lot today. These are some heady concepts, but I want to talk a little bit more about this because ultimately what we will see is that when the government is allowed to print fiat paper money, it will destabilize economies It will allow for deficit spending and for loose credit, and therefore will create inflation in a society and ultimately a loss of lifestyle and life well-being in that society for its citizens. We'll see this in the next class and in future lectures. I look forward to seeing you on the chat boards.